The steel ribs of the world felt like a drumbeat as the B-17 Flying Fortress climbed through a slate sky, each creak and breath of that heavy plane counting the crew's chances with cruel arithmetic. The problem that machine and men tried to solve was simple and terrible: deliver tons of bombs to the heart of enemy industry and return with enough of the crew alive to do it again. In the winter of 1942 and into 1943, the United States 8th Air Force faced a strategic gridlock over Northwest Europe. The solution required daylight precision bombing that only a rugged, heavily armed four-engine bomber could attempt. But doing so across hostile skies meant every mission invited an equation of loss, where mission success and crew survival were inversely proportional. If the 8th failed to cripple German aircraft production and ball-bearing factories, Allied air superiority would remain out of reach, and the invasion timetable would be jeopardized. Failure came in men lost, bases emptied, and a grinding attrition that no democracy could sustain indefinitely. The B-17 evolved from a designer's insistence on ruggedness and redundancy, trade-offs that made it heavy but survivable. Engineers packed it with multiple spars, self-sealing fuel tanks in the inner wings, and a web of armor plates around the crew stations which raised the gross weight and limited ceiling but offered a fighting chance against flak and cannon. Its defensive doctrine was collective firepower. 15 machine guns in turrets and waist positions meant it could trade bullets with fighters rather than flee. That doctrine created weaknesses. The fortress was optimized for formation flying, so guns could mutually cover blind spots. But tight formations turned pilots into moving ant farms, easy targets for ground fire and tracers that revealed axis vectors for enemy fighters. Crews learned to fly in boxed formations called combat boxes and adapted by changing altitude, adjusting bomb runs, and in some squadrons, repainting noses for identification. Maintenance men jury-rigged mufflers, patched hydraulic lines with scraps, and sometimes wired cockpit instruments with salvaged parts because the tempo of operations outpaced factory replacement. Those improvisations kept planes aloft but concealed a brutal fact. A machine designed to absorb damage still offered only statistical odds of survival. Inside, survival boiled down to rituals and small practicalities. Before takeoff, crews checked guns with a sequence learned like prayer. Empty the belt, count rounds, swing the gun through its arc, listen for feed problems. Flight engineers stenciled chalk tally marks on oxygen cans and fuselage side panels to mark missions flown. A tacit ledger of attrition that some crews kept like a confessional. The smell of hydraulic fluid and machine oil mixed with the metallic tang of cold oxygen filled the nose bubble. Gunners wiped grease on the leather of their gloves until the seams frayed. Radios would hiss and crackle at the first hint of weather, and a jammed interphone meant that the pilot's commands arrived as short, clipped pulses through hand signals or prearranged light flares. Goggles fogged over in the high-altitude cold, and the bitter taste of antifreeze sometimes coated a crew member's lips after a leak. Superstitions grew. A particular pin-up might ride in the nose of a bomber for luck, or a ball of string would be kept in the waist to count blessings and death. Those human measures did nothing to change the math, but they changed how Mubin faced it. Aha moment. 1. The fortress's greatest advertised strength, its sheer amount of defensive guns, became a strategic liability when Allied formations were routed by concentrated fighter tactics. Massed fields of fire worked only in perfect geometry. Aha moment 2. High altitude did not guarantee safety. Flak corridors and predicted fighter interceptions turned altitude into a predictable variable rather than a shield, and the Germans learned to focus fire into the corridors where box formations funneled through. Aha Moment 3. Long-range escort fighters were the variable that altered the calculus. When P-51 Mustang escorts could reach deep into Germany, survival rates improved more from fighter cover than from heavier armor on bombers. Those three revelations reshaped doctrine, but they did not erase the moments of terror that defined the air war. On a late autumn morning over the Ruhr, a single formation tightened into its box with the precision of a farmer's harvest pattern, and the cinematic scene unfolded. Engines bellowed in a cold, thin air as the lead element leveled into the bomb run, flak candles popping below with orange puffs that rose like malevolent hyacinths. A waist gunner smelled cordite and saw a burst rip through the trailing edge of his wing. The interphone screamed with static, and the bomb aimer's voice, when it came, was small and thin. A shell struck aft, severing control cables and sending the tail gunner's seat twisting like a puppeted limb. A medic moved forward, though he could not reach the shattered compartment. The formation's mutuality trapped them. The damaged B-17 could not leave the box without exposing the rest. Yet staying meant flying at slow speed with a crippled machine that bled altitude. Above them, twin engine fighters thundered through tracers, their cannon flashes eating at the sky. In that concentrated moment, a navigator recalculated fuel. A pilot feathered a propeller to compensate for asymmetric thrust, and a bombardier slid his bombs forward and mentally resighted the target, while glass shards still fell like geese from the plexiglass. Survival in that instant depended on three human acts: the pilot's feel of the controls, the engineer's rapid switch to auxiliary pumps, and the gunner's steady aim. The plane made it home with a ragged wing, but two men did not. Operationally, the Fortress performed as a blunt instrument that sharpened and dulled as the war progressed. In the early campaigns over occupied Europe, crews faced casualty rates that approached the inexorable. Squadrons logged cycles where a single tour of 30 missions meant survival for a minority. As tactics evolved, long-range fighters extended their reach, radar-directed flak improved, and day-precision attacks forced organizers to weigh risk against return. The Luftwaffe adapted with head-on attacks aimed at the vulnerable lower forward quadrant, and later with experienced fighter pilots employing high-speed slashing passes that reduced the effective coverage of the defensive turrets. Logistics mattered as much as courage. Maintenance backlogs meant that worn airframes went on missions with patched rivets and split fuel lines, amplifying the chance that damage became fatal. By late 1944, the combination of improved escort fighters, better electronic countermeasures, and modified formations reduced loss rates, yet attrition had already formed its own legacy of learning. Air crews who survived early years carried scars and tactics into later missions, and the industrial chain that fed the air war strained to replace both planes and trained men. The human arithmetic of loss left marks on families, airfields, and the planes themselves. Crews kept memorials tucked into compartments, photographs folded into gunners' kits, a toasted glove pinned to a bulkhead where a friend had once braced himself. Ground crews painted replacement noses and victory chevrons, counting sorties in concentric circles of paint. Statistics told a cold story. A bomber group might suffer 20% losses over a campaign, yet the lived reality was that probabilities intersected with chance and skill. A calm hand on the yoke saved more lives than another set of armor plates. Myths grew around heroic last stands, but when historians opened the mission logs, they found improvisation and small innovations. Gun covers altered to prevent icing. Incendiary belts changed position to reduce jamming that had outsized effects on survival. Late in the war, supply and geography reshaped outcomes. As Allied forces pushed into continental Europe, forward bases reduced escort distances and maintenance cycles shortened. Air superiority became less contested, and the fortress's role adjusted to tactical support and transport. Conversely, within the German interior, the tight-knit defense network and shorter interception windows still exacted heavy tolls on deep penetration missions. The final lesson lay in arithmetic married to adaptability. The B-17 could be engineered and taught to survive better, but only when strategic policy, industrial output, and air doctrine aligned to reduce the exposure that had cost so many lives. The calculations that measured survival were never merely numbers on a ledger. They were the cold mathematics of breathing, metal, weather, and human error, and every figure represented a crew member staring through frost-cracked glass, counting not the miles to the target, but the seconds between flak bursts. Decades later, those fields still yield fragments of aluminum and the faint stain of burned canvas, and men who flew in those boxes carried the memory of math sharpened into a kind of sorrowed, precise knowledge.